All right, Tom Kizzia, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So you came up to Alaska in the mid '70s, came up to Homer, and then worked for the Anchorage Daily News from Homer through the '70s and '80s. Is that right?
A little complicated. I started out at the Homer News right out of college and in 75. And then in early 80s, I moved up to Anchorage to work at the Anchorage Daily News.
Okay.
And then it was in 89 during the spill when I came back to Homer and kind of had the best of both worlds. And from then on, I was ADN reporter, but based in Homer.
hmm When I think about great times to be in Alaska, I think about the statehood and just what that would have looked like, kind of the before and after to live through that. And then the '70s are all so appealing just because there was so much going on. You had Angska at the beginning, you had Anilka coming in at the end, and it just seemed like a really wild time to be in Alaska. My family moved up in '86. That was kind of the blank check education. Both my parents were teachers. So when you moved up in the mid '70s, what was Homer like? You had what 1,500 or so people. What was kind of the vibe that you got when you got there?
Yeah, it was a funny place. It seemed like a real like I had discovered this remote spot that where nobody had ever been before, you know? It kind of felt like that when you showed up. There was no big chamber of commerce waiting for tourists to show up and welcoming you with signs and open arms. Seemed kind of indifferent to whether you came or not. And there was one guy who had a boat in the bay and you could pay him to take you sport fishing. And it seemed like, really? Who would pay to go sport fishing? Why would that work? So it was definitely a different sort of vibe then, but it was also, that in addition to the political issues that you mentioned with the land claims and the parks that was when the pipeline was being built. And so there was all this money arriving and population and change was in the wind, and so everything seemed like it was all tumbling together and happening all at once.
Mm.
Yeah, that made it great time to be a journalist.
Yeah. You wrote that Homer was different then. Old timers were uneasy about the newcomers and hippies, and that was kind of there's always been if you're a newcomer, you aren't as accepted. Do you think Homer has softened a little bit about newcomers, more welcoming of newcomers, or maybe how long did it take for you to be kind of welcomed or it kind of I guess shed that newcomer stink?
Yeah. I it took a couple of years to, establish myself. I felt like it's really more a question of how I felt about it, and I felt like I was part of it when I finally bought some land and built a cabin and you sort of learned the basics of carpentry in order to put up a cabin and just kind of settle in at that level. It was changing and it changed fast after that. I think that after the big oil fight in Kachemak Bay, it became much more of a tourist-oriented place where newcomers were arriving, and pretty soon it wasn't long before I found myself being one of the more old timers, That's just the way it goes. So, yeah, there was a lot of turnover, and I think one of the things that's made it an attractive place is that a lot of people have, traveled the world and had interesting jobs and educations and come over the bluff and say, wow, when they get to Homer and move in here. So there's a kind of worldliness to the population or to parts of it that make for good art galleries and restaurants and things. So it has a little bit more of a cosmopolitan flair than you would think a little town at the end of the road might otherwise have.
Has it stayed pretty true to its roots? Because it is way out the road. You're hours from Anchorage, but you are hours from Anchorage, so that can work both ways. So, has it kind of been infiltrated by some of the bigger city issues, or is it still kind of have that really quaint small town vibe? I've been there a couple times. Once when I was, you know, when we first moved up, and then another time a couple years ago when my wife and I went on our honeymoon up there and you visit a place, it can be difficult to get a real true feeling of the vibe and what people who live there feel like. So how is it staying true to its roots?
Yeah, I in some ways it really has been because it is distant from Anchorage far enough to require, a commitment to drive down. But I think the other thing that's really saved the town is the Jones Act, and then the fact that cruise ships can't really hit it in a big way. We get a couple of cruise ships, maybe half a dozen in the summer, that are on eccentric itineraries, but we don't have the kind of volume that you get in Ketchikan, and that can be much more transformative of sort of when you talk about a community vibe. We also have the benefit of the Homer Spit, and all the sort of summer activity seems to take place out there at the end of the spit. And I've described it as a kind of lymph node for tourism. So, it all happens out there, and you can avoid it unless you've got to go out to the harbor or something, or you can go relish it. I mean, I remember my daughter really wanting to work out there, and I thought, why would you want to go out on the spit in the summer? I was avoiding it usually, and then I realized, half of her class was out there all working jobs, and there was a kind of underworld of high schoolers that had a great time out there. So that now I understand.
Yeah, a great place to grow up. The types of jobs that a teenager can have up here can really help with their confidence and their growth because you're not just stereotypically flipping burgers. You're dealing with tourists. You're being a kayak guide or whatever it is. So it's super interesting. When you moved up and you were writing stories, did it take a little bit to adjust to maybe the style of the town and the types of stories that you were getting? Maybe everything was a novelty, but it was just very ordinary for Homer type people. How'd you adjust for to the type of writing and the audience?
Oh, I I got really excited as soon as I got here. It was just seemed great because Homer was in the midst of a major battle between the sort of old guard Chamber of Commerce, which was excited about oil leases that the state had sold right out in the bay, and the whole commercial fishing fleet, which was up in arms against this. And so it was a huge environmental fight going on, but it was not, the environmentalists weren't part of it. It was sort of this blue collar fleet against the sort of old timers pushing this notion of all development will be good for us. And it just was, it broke out in so many ways. There were so many stories about that to put into the paper that I kind of got just really excited right from the start. That whole year was, and it ended in the most dramatic fashion possible with the oil companies screwing up and having an oil spill of their own on their supposedly flawless jackup rig that was parked off the spit, and forced the state's hand to the legislature to turn around and buy the leases back, and the fishermen won, and it was just an amazing drama. I mean, it was like a TV miniseries, and here I was sort of writing it in live time. So that was pretty exciting as a new guy in town to be able to focus on that. And then, of course, figuring out everything else that was going on in town. And I wasn't, perfect in that way. I remember going by the high school saying, "Wow, look at all those cars. I wonder what's going on there." And of course, it was graduation at the high school, and I was so sort of clueless that, now as having had two kids go through the high school, I realize what a big deal graduation night is and how the local weekly should be there. So, I had to figure stuff out, but it was a great time to be writing, and from then on all through the 80s, all of the stories that were happening in Alaska. That was always for me through my whole career really was finding stories that captured what was happening in this historical moment in Alaska.
Context can be really important. So, like today, you can just do a pretty simple Google search, and you can find out what else has been written out there. You can it's pretty easy to get a lot of that information. So how did you kind of get the foundational or the background information that you needed for these stories? Was it just talking to old timers or to make sure the story is told in a way that, provides that context? How was that adjustment?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to go back and remember how I did that, but there was a lot of talking and research that was required. And also I had a bit of I saw these as sort of national issues, the pipeline and the the parks. You said, the parks happening at the end of the 80s, but really the Anilka, it was passed in 1980, but through the 1970s, the D2 question was
Mhm.
front and center in everybody's mind. How many parks are going to be created? What's the acreage? What are the rules going to be? And that was really one of the big issues throughout that period. And I came up to sort of see Alaska. I came up as a mountain climber initially on a summer trip from college we did a first descent down near Cordova and on a month-long trip. And I thought, wow, I want to come back and to start my career here as a journalist. And then it turned out to be my whole career, you
Hmm.
know.
You also were doing was crime or the police beat, was that your first beat, and then you kinda morphed into some of those other political things?
Yeah, when I went up to Anchorage in 82 to start working at the Anchorage Daily News, they offered me the oil and gas beat because I'd been in Alaska for a while. I wasn't a new reporter and I sort of understood the pipeline and all. And that was kind of a prestigious beat. And the only other beat that was open was the police beat. And I kind of surprised them by taking the police beat. But at that point in my career, I still felt like I was learning to write. And it was as a writer that I wanted to be able to be out on the streets writing human interest stories and dramatic stories. And I didn't want to spend my time, studying environmental impact statements and interviewing white collar executives. So it was a great choice. Great. I mean, it was really smart for me because it was kind of a fork in the road and it affected the kind of writer that I became.
Mm. As an outdoors columnist, that kind of romanticized the newsroom experience. You watch those movies where everybody is there and they're walking, whether it be like a Woodward and Bernstein the documentary or even Fletch. You just have people who are in the newsroom and they're talking about ideas. They're editing. They're just discussing things, and there's this energy of news that I only experienced a little bit in college, and then I haven't had it since, where I've just been, sending in columns to the Journal Empire. So, what was it about just kind of the way journalism functioned in the 70s and 80s that allowed you to write good news stories and grow as a writer and then report on these really impactful topics?
Well, it's really true that newsroom energy was wonderful and uplifting. And it's too bad. I think now a lot of newsrooms are made up of reporters working remote, working from home, and there isn't that kind of cyclone energy anymore. I mean, especially when there would be a big story breaking, a plane crash or something, and it can be gruesome if you sort of step back. But if everybody's kind of running in different directions and there's a captain pointing people in different directions. It's pretty good for the energy level and to learn from one another too. So yeah, it was a good time.
Mhm. I was a junior in college or maybe a sophomore in college when 9/11 happened. And I remember one of my first I woke up and I just went to the paper just to see what was going on, and you have all these, fellow college journalists trying to track down, whomever. And I wrote sports, and so we were trying to track down former U of A basketball players who were in Manhattan or living in Manhattan, and
Mm.
just you feel that need to tell the story and get the information out there. And it was such a tragic event, but my memories are of that cohesiveness and telling the story and doing your duty to the reading community.
It
Jumping
was kind of true during the oil spill too.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I felt like the journalists were some of the only professionals who were able to do something constructive, because there was so much ridiculous energy going into quote cleanup and, boats running around and everybody running this way and that, but really accomplishing nothing. And at least we were able to use our energy to document what was going on and to talk about the shortcomings.
Mhm. Would you say that's the kind of the biggest thing that you covered? Obviously, you've written multiple books, but as far as like a news event happening, is that the biggest thing that you've contributed to covering?
Yeah, I guess, in terms of single thing like that. Yeah, but like going out to McCarthy in 1983 and as a reporter to cover the massacre out there, the sort of mass shooting, 6 dead in this ghost town, and I was the only one out there, you know, that felt pretty momentous and powerful, and one of the reasons I liked being in Alaska as a journalist was because I liked to be out working on my own
Mm.
and not be in a scrum of reporters holding microphones and phones up, trying to get a snatch of a quote from somebody walking by, the sort of image that you have of journalism in Washington, D.C. I liked, for 2 years, my job in the '80s at the ADN was to go off into the bush and write about what it's like for people out there
Mhm.
and living out there.
And that was your first book, and that was published in, was that 91? That
Yeah, so I did the traveling in the mid to late '80s, and then had a chance to take a couple years off and work on it as a book.
Mhm. And
And
that
that's where I learned so much about writing.
Yeah, it's wild that Alaska is so diverse, so you can call yourself an Alaskan, but I grew up in Southeast Alaska, so I feel much more like a Southeast Alaskan than I am any other type of Alaskan because you spend time in Fairbanks, and that's a totally different world, and then,
Mm.
Homer, Anchorage, all those different locations are completely different, so it can be difficult as you're traveling around to get that same credibility or whatever it is. So as you're traveling around, like what was something that was maybe an obstacle for you as a writer to earn the trust of the local families that you're visiting?
Well, a lot of what I was writing about was in the native villages, and I had to learn how to not push myself there, but to be kind of quiet and listen and watch and learn, and not, it wasn't going to stories didn't always yield to aggressive questioning. In fact, that would make people clam up. So that was a lesson learned. But it's just it was hard to. I guess I was traveling as on that kind of knife edge of I was an Alaskan exploring Alaska, my home, getting to know my home better, but I was also an outsider, a white colonist type guy from the city, the big city, coming into this native community. And so I was aware of my role as an outsider too. And I would sort of flip back and forth. And in the book, I kind of worked on that issue. Am I part of this? Is this my home, or am I a visitor? And there was not a one answer to that. It's a tension, and working that tension was the writer's job.
Mhm. We moved up to Kilwaukee in '86. Like I said, my dad was a music teacher, and he started the concert at 6 p.m., and the tradition was kind of you show up, you don't necessarily have to be very precise, and so dad started it right on time, and some of the parents were still kind of filing in, and some of them were a little upset that, he would, they're not as precise. It doesn't have to be, they're not used to that. But once they found that he was there and he was starting at 6 p.m. for the sake of the kids, and the cultural difference was, for the benefit of the kids, like, that was kind of, accepted, and they definitely liked it, but my brother and I were the only blonde kids in the school, and it was pretty
Mm.
wild, but it was cool just to see how accepting and how, we just felt part of the community. And when I go home now, I live in Ketchikan, but when I go back to Kloak, the elders still say, "Welcome home," and it's incredibly welcoming as long as you don't do things to betray the trust. And if you go there with the best interest and an open mind, and you don't try to force yourself upon these smaller communities, then they're very, very helpful and very welcoming.
Yeah, yeah, and that was something that I wanted to capture in my pieces was the kindness and the warmth of those communities. You're talking about Southeast being so different. 2 years ago, I wrote a long series for the Anchorage Daily News, kind of working. I'm no longer working there, but as a, you know, freelance deal about Sitka and story that happened at the time of Sitka's forming, and the when the American flag first went up, and the sort of the taking of that land from the Kwans of the Tlingit, all of that southeast thing, I really didn't know much about, and it was like coming into a new state almost. It was a great opportunity for me. Again, I was, this is my home, Alaska, but really didn't know much of that history, and so to be able to jump into that and with such a good story to tell within that realm was a great opportunity.
Yeah, you go to Petersburg and it's just Norway. And you go to
Hmm.
Sitka and it's Russia, and then Juneau and it's you get a lot more of that, there's obviously the underlying native traditional cultures, the indigenous that have lived there, but it's because of the islands, you just have the unique individual culture and the history there. Yeah, it's super, super interesting to travel around and see that here in Southeast. That's not to say that the interior doesn't have a variety of cultures, but there are some big historical events here in Southeast that, provide that difference in cultures.
Yeah, I told the story before, but I have a friend who lives in a two-bedroom apartment in Tribeca in New York City, and she had a dream, and she raised two kids there, sort of a boy and a girl sharing one bedroom. And she had a dream once about pushing through her clothes in her closet and discovering a trap door that opened onto a third bedroom that she never knew she had. And to me, that was what it felt like, sort of discovering Southeast as this whole realm, as I say, of Alaska that I didn't really appreciate until I kind of found myself in the midst of it.
Yeah. So you'd been in Alaska for over a decade when you wrote that book, and then how did having some experience in Alaska help you write that book? And then later on, writing about McCarthy and the Pilgrims and how did your experience help you write those really heavy stories? And had that maybe happened earlier on in your career, how would you have been able to handle that?
It would have been hard to sustain the book length narrative, I suppose, earlier in the career. I think when I was writing The Wake of the Unseen Object, which was the first book, I was trying to convert what had been a series of stories into kind of travel narrative. And in the late 80s, the genre of literary travel was, front and center in all the bookstores, and Bruce Chatwin and Jonathan Rabin and other, famous in that realm names. And so I read all those writers avidly and sort of taught myself how to do what they were doing. And so I think that was a transformative for me. Then when I came back to work at the Anchorage Daily News after having written that book, I was a different kind of storyteller.
Mhm.
The and again, the Pilgrim family one, I was drawn to that story. There were the family out in McCarthy that was fighting against the National Park Service, and I thought, what a great way to talk about the coming of parks and the old sort of frontier mentality that was lingering in Alaska, and the clash between the two, and this one family that was seemed to me self-consciously trying to present themselves as something out of the American past, this kind of pious Christian, simple living family. And so I was covering it initially as that story. And then when I got out to see them and sort of realized what a cult the father had built around his 15 children, the story shifted into a much darker place. And of course, it was once the children escaped that I realized that there was a book to be written, but the story really had to be the kids' story and their effort to sort of come to consciousness and escape this world where they had never been taught to read or write, and they'd never seen television or had friends, or the only book in the in the house was the King James Bible, and their father would read it to them at night, and that was their big entertainment. And of course, he was reading just select passages to reinforce his sort of patriarchal abuse. And so anyway, that was the story was on the book would only be palatable if it was a book about the kids escaping and not a book about a creepy dad.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you had to have a good level of self-awareness when you're going to these rural communities and talking with people. So developing those skills, you mentioned in that book that when you had the chance to talk to Papa Pilgrim, you had to be very aware of his his aura. I don't know, sounds positive when it wasn't clearly it wasn't a positive aura, but you had to be able to be self-aware enough to know not to push, but also get him talking. So how does someone develop those people skills to be able to allow someone to let you in while also being objective and finding the truth?
Well, I was the right person for the right at the right moment, I guess. It's yeah, you're a little bit. I was aware that. Well, I could sense his narcissism when I was with him, and so I could play to that to get him talking. And but I don't know that it was any deep dark secret. I was just trying to. He thought because I have a cabin in McCarthy, and he had snowed a lot of the community into thinking he was what he said he was, that I would fall for it as well. At least he was hoping that would be the way I'd react, and so I didn't disabuse him of that, or I didn't express a lot of skepticism about what he was telling me in that first meeting. Of course, once I wrote my story, then I was banished forever from his sight, and I got the full sort of cult leader attack mode that he went into with me.
Mm. What toll does that take on you? I know covering the police beat can be kind of entertaining and there's energy and you're reporting on people who are making poor decisions, but later on you're writing this story. Like how do you psychologically kind of remove yourself from it and just you think about the kids and you think about what the impact of this and as you dig deeper the connections to the Kennedy assassination. It's an incredible story. So how do you kind of keep your mind set and fixated on seeing this through the end knowing that there's just so much darkness involved?
Mm. Well, it's similar to what I was saying about being insider and being an outsider, being, going there as going to the villages as an Alaskan, but as also an outsider. You're partly excited by the stories that you're telling because they're great stories, and you're also, kind of afraid of them. And I talk about that in the beginning of Cold Mountain Path, the history of the ghost town of McCarthy. I tell the story of going out to cover the mass shooting out there and getting to talk to one of the few people who were still alive out there who had lost his wife in the shooting the day before. And he told me a lot about the people who had been killed, and it was amazing stuff. And I got on the plane to fly back to Anchorage, and on one level, really excited in a bizarre way, but I think in a way that other journalists would understand, where I have an amazing story and I really got some good interviews and I can really tell this story and make this come alive for people when I get back there. And this is going to be great. But the guy I talked to also asked me if when I got landed at Merrill Field to tell his son had a job there and he hadn't been able to get through to his son working as an airplane mechanic. And could I go by his office there and tell him that his mother had been killed?
Mm.
And so on the one level, I was like really kind of perversely excited to be telling the world about these 6 people. But then the personal responsibility of having to go tell a young man that his mother was dead was just terrifying to me. I mean, deeply, profoundly upsetting. And I was kind of gyrating between these two emotions as I flew back in this small plane over the Chugach Mountains, bouncing around. The bouncing seemed to be, emotional as well as physical. And, you know, as a writer, you write about both of those things and try to be honest about the tension between the two of them. You don't go all the way one way or the other.
Mhm. Is it more important, you think, to be really, really curious, or is an element of like needing to be almost obsessed to make sure that you cover all the angles? Which do you think does a journalist better? Just a deep curiosity to tell the story, or an almost obsessive like pursuit of the story?
I'm not sure I follow. I mean, I think it's the same thing as the
Okay.
curiosity, but you do learn in a long career to trust your sense when you say, I really need to make one more phone call
Mm,
because I'm not sure about this fact. And, y- you know, you learn to push you stay late, make those extra calls, double check everything.
mhm.
That's something, when you're a young reporter, you think you got it. You often don't have it nailed down, and it's hard because sometimes you're like calling the person you're writing a embarrassing story about, and it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's way more. You learn that it's even more uncomfortable to not make that call and then to be embarrassed by something that's wrong in the story the next morning.
Mhm.
So you do learn to push deep.
When you are writing one of these stories that does have a lot of depth, I've heard both where, like, the story kind of writes itself, but then also some people try to fit a narrative into it, it doesn't really match, so how do you not overwrite something where you put too much of yourself into it? How do you balance that? You include yourself, to help with the narrative, but you don't include too much of yourself and you let the story be the thing, not like your opinion or your commentary on the story, end up being a bigger part of the story. I think in contemporary society, we have so many like purpose-driven journalists so people can start with a conclusion and they then mold the story to come to that conclusion, which is I think one of the reasons why there's so much distrust in parts of the media today, because it's that purpose-driven stuff. So how do you let the story tell itself, you include yourself, but you don't get too involved or you don't override it?
Well, I think one thing is that you find really good writers to learn from.
Mm,
And so, you train yourself by reading the greats, and the greats are the ones who don't push their faces into the stories. I learned early, and again, this is more from my reading initially, and then proved it in my writing, was that the more powerful, and this is again also a lesson of the police beat, I guess, but the more powerful the emotion, the more understated your prose has to be. And if you're saying just something simple and minimalist about something that happened that was terrifying, the reader just leans in and starts filling in stuff. And if you're saying, and then it was a terrible thing, and there was blood dripping everywhere, and then the reader backs away and says, ugh,
mm,
and so when you by that sort of learning to work that emotion, you can really pull the reader into the story, and you learn that sticking yourself in there excessively is going to undermine your goal, which is to write a story that grips a reader.
mhm.
So there's that.
Yeah, one of the things I liked most about Pilgrim's Wilderness was the narrative of the land use and bringing that whole the issue of, we're still figuring applications of that and the park service, and this is what it's supposed to be, but then you have a new context, you have a new issue, and all of a sudden, the bulldozer becomes a huge symbol of what are we going to do with this land? What do we do in this situation with the land? Rather than turn that into a more, political or ideological narrative. I like that you let the story tell itself, and the bigger issue was the park. It wasn't, making it a big, "Oh, these are, like, Christian fundamentalists are the people that we should be worried about. It's like, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. Like, this is the big story here, and leaving it at that. I really appreciated that because I, again, fitting a narrative into the story or trying to mold that. I think a lot of people would be tempted today to try to make this comment a social commentary and comment on that more so than the story itself. So as far as the park service and that as symbolic of our land use, what did you seen leading up to that? So between the 70s and this was in the early 2000s when Pilgrim moved up and the battle with the Park Service kind of started with that. How had Alaska kind of shifted, changed, or our attitudes towards land use adapted or evolved in those 2 decades?
Yeah, well, so there was a lot of controversy in McCarthy area in the 70s over the creation of the park. But by the time the Pilgrims showed up, there'd been a park for 20 years, and he was trying to kind of push it back to the pre-park days. And there were old timers around who responded to that, but there was a whole superstructure of park management at that point, and you can't really go back to the past. That was one of the lessons of that period. And I think McCarthy had sort of lingered a little bit in the past more than a lot of Alaska. I think there were other parts. I think the famous story that gets told often is Seward, which had a staunch opposition to creating a national park in their area, Kenai Fjords National Park. And then once it got created, the community did a 180 and over time, built up a whole huge tourism industry built around their proximity to this national park. And in fact, to the point where I did a story once where I interviewed the head of the chamber who is a kind of new to the town. And I talked about, so why was the town against all this park back in the day? And he thought it was like the just the negativity of the the he thought it was the outsiders who were against it at the time. He didn't understand that it was his predecessor. It was the Chamber of Commerce, the establishment that was the voices against the park in those early days. So, I think that the park acceptance has changed over time, but then again, you've got like Ada and the voices of development pushing their Ambler Road out into the sort of untouched parts of the Brooks Range, and seemingly without any sort of discussion of what's being lost or what's the potential for loss in putting a road into the last unroaded mountain range.
Mhm.
And others as well, the Wet'suwet'en Road, the other road construction, roads to resources mentality, that doesn't seem to be, I think history will catch up with Alaska, and that it's those wild unroaded areas that we have to give the world, much more important than a couple more holes in the ground for minerals that they can get in other places. And I think that's understood now. That was certainly the debate in the 70s as well. And in a way, that same debate is coming around again. I feel like the Ada board is kind of the last vestige, the last repository of manifest destiny, that it's kind of a 19th century attitude toward we can rest when we've got roads to every resource on the continent.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's not even an apples to apples comparison because the road, the Dalton Highway goes north and it's the oil fields and the oil is pumped through the pipeline. So if you have this ore that's being driven the 218 miles and then down the Dalton Highway, like that's a massive amount of traffic. And they've done studies about the fugitive dust. So you get the contaminant dust that comes out of the trucks that be hauling the ore. So it's going to contaminate in a way that is way different than you experience with Prudhoe Bay because you're not trucking the oil south. Then open pit mines are obviously way different than drilling for oil, the oil infrastructure. So it's it's Pretty
It's also
pretty
interesting to go back and review the debates over the Dalton Highway, or the Hall Road as it was known in the 70s, and the promises to keep it closed, that it would be just an industrial road and it wouldn't, change things a lot because it would just be the supply trucks going up and down. And then it, because of its funding sources, they said, well, we can't keep the public out. That's not legal. And so suddenly, with a wave of the magic wand, it became an open road. And, I think the same would happen inevitably. There's going to be, hunters and tourist vans driving from Anchorage and Fairbanks out to see the Ambler country. I'd like to go out there, but it's going to be so different if it's if there's trains of RVs going out there, and hunters with their all-terrain vehicles
Mhm.
to go after the caribou. So I just think, if you just got to look 20 years into the future and not look 2 years into the future.
Yeah, we're kinda looking back into the past down here in Southeast too, just seeing the amount of logging that was done on state land, on corporation land, on state federal land. The appetite for logging down in Southeast has really dwindled. There's some ideas about focusing more on second growth and, what can we do to maybe help mills transition to logging second growth, but the idea that we're taking more old growth at a loss and shipping it overseas is just something that we're pretty far past that. We've evolved. We've definitely transitioned to the tourism. We got misty fjords that people want to fly out to. We got a lot of stuff that people want to see, but the pristine habitat is far more valuable than trying to cut deeper and deeper into the timber that's so important for the ecosystem.
I was a writer on board of a couple of cruise ships during COVID, and just to sort of see what the cruise ship thing was like. And we went into Glacier Bay, and it was exciting to be up on the top deck and to see the enthusiasm of the people up there for seeing Alaska and seeing wilderness. And, it wasn't everybody. I mean, half the ship was down in their staterooms nursing hangovers, but those who were, excited about being in Glacier Bay were truly, having the time of their life. And even though I was kind of in tears at the same time, because I was looking at the shrinking glaciers and seeing it as, you know, a lost world, and they were seeing it as timeless nature. So we had different views of what we were perceiving in front of us, but it was nice to be in their presence.
Yeah. It's conflicting because as people you've been here longer than I have, but we have seen what's kind of been lost and we kind of maybe appreciate and understand like where things are going and what the populations of fish or whatever it is, caribou, we have more of a idea of the shifting baselines. Someone else comes up here and loves it and appreciates it, and we can then see just how much better it is as far as an intact ecosystem compared to what people are experiencing on the East Coast. And so it's kind of refreshing that, yes, this is still incredible and it's still very grand and still extremely wild. And it's definitely to be appreciated. But also, like you said, those warning signs and like what have we lost and what can we do about it? And can we do anything at this point? Yeah, it can be conflicting.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So what else is on the horizon? You got another book, another writing project? What else you got?
Well, I'm still have that great tie to the ADN, so I've been able to write some things for them. And I'm thinking about the issue that's coming up next week in the US Supreme Court about birthright citizenship,
Mm,
because my story set in Sitka was the story of the first girl born there in the colony after the US flag went up. And her parents were not US citizens. They were German Jews who had immigrated. And she was born there, and it was a year after the 14th Amendment was ratified. So she had birthright citizenship. When she was 6 years old, her parents, for family reasons, changed their plans and went back to Germany. So she grew up in Germany and in the 1930s found herself trapped there as a Jew. Couldn't get a visa to the U.S., but in 1938 was able to get a passport from the U.S. Embassy because of her birthright citizenship and made it out just before the war. And that was, like I say, that's the first white girl born in Alaska after it became a U.S. possession. So that's an amazing story, and kind of makes you kind of drives home the importance, I think, of that 14th Amendment and the meaning of it. And so I wrote that story, but I'd like to maybe do something more to address the issue as it's sort of shaped itself here in this past year under the Trump administration's effort to do away with birthright citizenship.
Well, and that's a 8-part series?
That one, yeah, that was an 8-part series about the story of Sitka's birth as a town of Americans and who were the Americans in there. And it turned out, half the town, the commercial part of the town, were these Jewish European Jews who had come to the U.S. and had followed the frontier up there. And it's not sort of our image of the frontier, the sort of popular image, but it's the reality. And that was the just a time, as I said, when they were like tearing the land away from the Tlinkits, and they had a fence around the Sitka town, and all the native people lived on the outside and had to be out by sundown. It was just pretty interesting to go into that period and that world.
Outside of your books, of course, what would be 2 or 3 of your top Alaska books, either books that take place in Alaska or books about Alaska, or that kind of capture the essence of Alaska that you'd recommend to people?
I always liked the book Arctic Village, Robert Marshall's book about Wiseman in the 1930s. That was one. And, like most writers of my generation, I'm a big John McPhee fan. And so Coming into the Country was the book. And funny, actually, was in 1975, I was in the Brooks Range with my college buddies, and that was the year that I was going to stay. I had just graduated. And while I was up there, I was reading John McPhee's book, The Pine Barrens, which was a kind of cross-disciplinary look at this rural area in New Jersey, which is the state where I grew up. And I thought it was a really interesting book. But then I remember while I'm sitting on a boulder up there in the Brooks Range with that notion of getting a job when the fall came and staying in Alaska, I thought, wait a minute, I could do for Alaska what John McPhee did for the Pine Barrens. I could sort of write this big, broad history of where we are and who the people are and blah, blah, blah. And so I was really excited. That was kind of my inspiration for staying. And then like a year later, my New Yorker subscription arrives, and there's part 1 of John McPhee's Coming into the Country. And he was doing for Alaska what he had done for the Pine Barrens. And it was a good idea, but I ended up having to wait a generation to finally I felt like the Pilgrim's Wilderness book was kind of addressing those issues that he addressed about change in Alaska, but looking at it, a pretty much a generation later.
Yeah, those are 2 great books to read back to back. I really have enjoyed reading your stuff, and then going back to Coming into the Country. That's just a good couple weeks of reading right there.
And then I finally had the chance to, because of Pilgrim's Wilderness, actually got to write a few stories for the New Yorker, and through my editor there, got in touch with John McPhee and told him that story, and he thought that was pretty funny.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks again for being on. I really appreciate it. Anything you want to add in closing, or pitch for the books? Where can people get them and all that?
No, I think they're around, and I see. I'm looking forward to seeing your book. I just was, when you got in touch, I looked it up and I saw you had a really great review in the Anchorage Daily News in February when I was traveling, and just got back to read that. So I'm excited to see that.
There's always a nervousness, you look up to the journalists and the writers that you look up to, and it feels the imposter syndrome starts to ooze out a little bit, and so I hope it's worth your time.
Well, I always feel an imposter syndrome when I'm out fly fishing,
Oh, well,
you know, which I've done a lot. I'm one of the few people in Homer who never bought a boat because to me, it wasn't sort of fun to ride around in a boat with a trailing line. I wanted to go down to the Anchor River or elsewhere and stand out there and throw at the blank water for a while. And that's been my side passion.
so much fun. You got great trout rivers there. It's so great. My wife and I did that with the fly rod. I think we were the only people on the Kizzia and the Kenai that were fly fishing. Everybody else was doing the little flossing deal, but we had our switch rods out there and we were casting and not catching anything, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and a little flossing is fun too to get your fish for the freezer. So I'm, do what I have to do.
That's right. Can't beat it.
Yep, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for your interest.
Thanks for listening. Please share. And if you found today's conversation useful, you can go deeper with my writing on Substack. That's where I expand on these ideas from the show, share essays, reporting, and things I'm thinking about in real time. You can find it at From the 49th on Substack. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.